Hello everyone, today in this video we will fight against the atmospheric of our world around us, and today I reply on the request of few of my spectators, and I will tell you a story, brief story about very interesting nation, now extinct. That nation was called Etruscans, and their main settlements were placed in nowadays Tuscany, in nowadays Italy, and they also in the best centuries for them, so 6th century BC and the 5th century BC, conducted some expansions into Corsica and a little bit on the north of Italy and a little bit to the south to Campania, and of course they also occupied Latium, and in Latium, according to tradition, in 753 BC, and recent archaeology slowly proves us that this traditional date it's not so mythical as people were thinking. So Rome was found in 753 AD, BC, around this, and firstly it was an Etruscan city. First kings we know, in majority they were ethnically Etruscans. About the Etruscan ethnicity I will tell you a few words. At least culturally and linguistically Etruscans, and Tarquinius Superbus. So Tarquinius the Proud, or Tarquinius who actually was hubris, because meaning of Superbus is closer to hubris than to the pride. So he was expelled, and Roman Republic about 510 BC was established, and since that time to 540 AD, consuls were elected. 2 consuls each year, the highest officials of the Roman Republic. So Etruscans were a nation whose origin was really, let's say, mysterious, and many good scholars, like for instance Italian scholar Massimo Pallottino, tried to solve the mystery of Etruscan origin. So even such great authorities like Mr. Pallottino sometimes were not really correct, because at the end of his conclusions in his famous book Etruscologia, published firstly in 1942, he assumed that the Etruscans are natives to their land. Some other great Etruscologists like Mr. Raymond Bloch, French Etruscologist, claimed, relying on literary sources mainly, according to Herodotus, that said that at the end of 13th century BC, more or less, Etruscans emigrated from nowadays Asia Minor, so those days Asia Minor and nowadays Turkey, to the Italy. Part of them emigrated because they were actually facing famine, so just to avoid this problem, part of the population went to the sea to look for another place to find inhabited, and they found. Some scholars, of course, rejected Herodotus because for many decades his work was not liked by many. I don't know why, it's very valuable. And they were trying to find some similarities between Etruscans and local Italian population of those days. When we look at the Etruscans, first preserved human representations of them have a little bit slanting eyes. With time, these slanting eyes are disappearing, and they have normal Indo-European round eyes. So it also suggests something, that being Etruscan was more cultural and linguistical than ethnical. And we have to know that it's nicely written in the book written by Jacques Eurgon, The Daily Life of the Etruscans, that only first generation of slaves was living in the slavery. Their children were free, and in most cases were assimilated into the Etruscan society. So we see that ethnically this society was not so pure, and I wouldn't be surprised that from time to time we can find even black Etruscans or blonde European Etruscans who were assimilated into this nation. I wouldn't be surprised, not at all. Ancient people had much more practical and much more sane approach to this issue, like to the sexual issues, than we have nowadays. So we have to take into account that Etruscans were great constructors. The all famous Roman hydraulics like irrigation, aqueducts, and so on, we have to say that this knowledge and technology Roman civilization owes to Etruscans, to their great predecessors. And we have to now mention that first big Etruscan city conquered by Romans was Veii, that was sacked by Romans in 396 BC, and the last Etruscan city that finishes the conquest of Etruria by Romans was Volsini and it was captured by Romans in 264 BC. Of course, Etruscan language survived for more than 300 years after the conquest, population as well. Etruscan literature was for a century or two since the conquest still very popular among Romans, so it means they knew this language. Later, of course, it was fading away and people started speaking Latin. So this is the story of the Etruscan people, and their civilization started to flourish about 11th-10th century BC in Tuscany. So it would correspond quite nicely to the message from Herodotus that at the end of 13th, in the beginning of 12th century BC, they came to Italy from Asia Minor. And there are some archaeological findings like the grave of the warrior from Lemnos, and some script in this grave was preserved, and this script is really similar to the Etruscan script. Actually, we are not so good in deciphering Etruscan language now. Specialists don't know it well. They can read only basic informations like some stelas and information of the stelas. The longer part of the Etruscan text was found on some vessels or in material that was used for bandages for some mummy in Egypt, because no one could read it anymore, so it was somehow transported to Egypt and utilized as bandages for one mummy. That it's now preserved in the museum in Zagreb in Croatia. That's why it's now called Mummy from Zagreb. So we know that investigating Etruscans it's not easy, but despite this fact we have quite good literature in English language, as I mentioned, famous book The Etruscans of Massimo Pallottino, translated from Italian, Howard Hayes Scholar, of course, the co-author of famous A History of Roman Empire down to Constantine with Mr. Max Carey. There are some younger ones, investigators of Etruscan civilizations like Mrs. McIntosh. Recently in the Routledge series of words, A Word of Etruscans few years ago was published. Unfortunately, I managed only to conquer a paperback of this book. It's over 1000 pages and it's hard to read. Hardcover I didn't manage to get, but okay, it's fine. There are also some classics works, as I mentioned, Jacques Ergaud and Mr. Raymond Bloch. First, I would recommend the beginners in the topic to read classics, and later to go to newer works by contemporary scholars, just to be aware that sometimes some political correctness or ideology, especially into recent works, can be implemented. That's why for the comparison and just to be able to make your own decision and your own judgment, one should also know old works. So this is a short movie about the Etruscans. I encourage you to study this civilization. Of course, there are so many other works about Etruscans, like Etruscan Civilization by Mr. Parker, also nicely published and nice description from 2000. I like it. And one Polish, it's in Polish, it was not translated into English unfortunately, one Polish archaeologist from Warsaw wrote great books about Etruscan art and Etruscan paintings that it's found in tumuluses, so Etruscan tombs. Really great piece of work, unfortunately not translated, or maybe I don't know about it yet. So there is a lot to read in different languages. Have a nice day, bye.